What's going on, trail and Ultrarunners? Welcome to another episode of the KoopCast. As always, I'm your host, Jason Koop, and if you saw the title to this podcast, Bone Health, I guarantee you it perked up your ears because maybe you've had a stress fracture in the past, maybe one of your training partners has had a stress fracture in the past, and you realize what a huge issue this can be in ultramarathon running. But you know what? Your bones play a bigger role in your health as an athlete and in your health as a person. And it's not just something to avoid. Stress fractures and injuries to bone are not just something to avoid. And so to get to the heart of the matter, I brought in a bone expert in Professor Craig Sale out of Nottingham Trent University. Craig is a professor of human physiology and the director for Sport, Health, and Performance Enhancement Research Center at Nottingham Trent University. He is also a fellow of the American College of Sports Medicine. He comes to us with a tremendous amount of experience in bone health for athletes. He's written a number of different papers on the subject, a lot of which I am going to link to in the show notes. And we just had an absolutely fascinating conversation about all things related to bone, the roles they play for athletes and in runners, and what is bone health. You know, a lot of times as athletes, we can mark our physical capabilities or our physical fitness with a time trial or a set of intervals or a race, but we don't have a really good way of determining what good bone health is. We also talk about how diet can affect bone health. And we also talk about how loading or training can affect bone health as well. And finally, we get into some practical implementation for athletes and for endurance athletes out there. So I hope you all find this podcast incredibly informative. And without any further ado, here we go. Here's my conversation with Craig Sale about all things related to bone health. I appreciate you joining in advance. I take it that microphone that I sent you didn't make it on time. It's stuck somewhere in the nether regions of shipping.
I mean, I think part of the issue is obviously with the lockdown and stuff, everything's a little bit disrupted. And so, something that would normally get there in a day or two is taking a week and that kind of thing, so...
It's funny because I've got a few of those microphones kind of floating around the UK and Europe. In fact, yesterday I did a recording with Glenn Davison, who you might be familiar with.
Yeah. Oh, I know, yeah.
Yeah, and getting him around from place to place, it's only, maybe a 2 or a 5 day ordeal right now.
Yeah.
Or usually it's only a 2 or 5 day ordeal, but now it's, who knows? They might be.
Yeah, I think everything's sort of much, much slower at the moment. I think, even though there are essential businesses around and the couriers are still running back and forth and, Amazon and making billions, I think it just depends on how you catch it, whether they've got a light shift or whatever, and it can just throw things off a little bit. But
yeah. My Amazon delivery person and UPS delivery person, who I know very well because I get a lot of deliveries, obviously, for not only for the audio equipment, but also for like athletic equipment, running stuff, for my coaching business and whatnot. We used to hang out when they'd come by and drop stuff off. And now, because of, probably a combination of fear and they're just too busy, it's like they just drop stuff off at my porch and bolt.
Wow, yeah. We're kind of similar. I had about a 20-minute conversation with the Amazon delivery person the other day, and they were saying it's just very busy at the minute, but that's to be expected, I guess.
Crazy, right? I imagine that you're people with a specialty in bone health. They're kind of hot commodities in the endurance spectrum, and that's just simply because of two reasons. One is like there's a high rate of prevalence of bony stress injuries in the endurance community, but also those types of injuries are killers. I mean, they tend to be season enders, and they also tend to be very, very repetitive. And as a byproduct of that, athletes get really hyper focused on bone, specifically from this viewpoint of, I'm trying to prevent a stress fracture.
Yeah.
But in reality, the bone plays a much bigger part in an athlete's health as a whole. So before we like dive down the injury and the stress fracture rabbit hole too much, let's like broaden the view up. Let's broaden the viewpoint up a little bit and just talk about what roles bone plays in an athlete's life in general.
Yeah, no, that sounds good to me. Yeah, we can definitely go down all of those routes. I think you're absolutely right. I think quite often people do focus a little bit too much on the stress fracture injury thing. Well, that's obvious, but I think, from my perspective, I normally say there are two concerns really for the athlete. And one is that longer term bone health perspective. And the other one is the bone stress injury,
And what do we know about how prevalent those bone injuries are, and how prevalent these like musculoskeletal injuries are in athletes? These types of studies are always hard to do, and typically they're done in like college types of settings where they're looking at a collegiate team or a group of collegiate athletes, or a specific group of collegiate athletes like females or cross country runners. But can we stylize a little bit of the incidence rate a little bit amongst endurance athletes?
Well, I think you've summarized that really, really well there, actually. It's very, very difficult to get at specific injury status of endurance athletes as a whole. I mean, I think generally speaking, there's such a wide reported incidence rate from, a couple of percent in some groups right the way through to sort of 70, 75, 80% even of people in other in studies and in other reported groups. And generally speaking, in people that have come through my lab, and so these are not studies that are designed specifically to look at this, but in groups that have come through our lab here at Nottingham Trent University, we've tended to see, relatively small percentages of individuals who perform games play. So rugby players, for example, tend to have quite a low incidence of bony stress injuries, around the 1-3% mark. But right the way through to a group of triathletes that have come through the lab, the incidence rate was up at 75%, ballet dancers up at 80%. So, I mean, there really is a very, very wide range. And even within specific athlete groups, I think it often depends on when you capture the information, how you capture the information. A lot of people, for example, don't necessarily record stress fractures, or only those stress fractures that have been radiographically confirmed, through imagery, through MRI or whatever. And they sort of do athlete report, which probably overestimates it.
Exactly. And I mean, you mentioned your lab, and you have a lot of tools available to diagnose these things, and also using blood markers to look at some of the indices of bone health. But I hear this term get thrown out a lot in the lay literature and also through the popular media. We need to be concerned with our bone health. But I'm not convinced that we have a really good working definition of that. Like, athletes will kind of like look at their fitness and say, okay, I ran these intervals faster yesterday than I did the week before that, and so I'm obviously more fit. I'm more capable of producing a, high quality result. But when we're talking about this word in quotes, bone health, is there a way that we can actually ascertain, does a person have good, better, best, poor type of bone health?
So that's a really good question, and I think you're absolutely right. Is that I think what bone health tends to mean to people is probably different. It quite often, depending on who it is you're speaking to and what their focus is. So you've already mentioned, for example, that the bony injury. So somebody who's receiving or getting a number of bone-related injuries probably has poor bone health as far as that focus is concerned. But that doesn't necessarily mean to say that that same individual also has low bone mass, for example. So, I mean, I think when you speak to a lot of people, what they are talking about when you say bone health is the absence or the presence of known bone diseases, which is osteopenia and osteoporosis. So this is a disease that's characterized by largely low bone mass, but also a microarchitectural deterioration of the bone tissue. And what that does is that leaves the individual susceptible to fractures, so osteoporotic fractures. And that can be quite serious. But generally speaking, you don't often see too many individuals that are, younger individuals with osteopenia and osteoporosis. You certainly can, but it's far more prevalent and common in the older population, of course. But of course, that's not necessarily health. That's the absence of disease, which is not quite the same thing. So in terms of bone health, I would say, it's having a sufficient bone structure and strength to cope with the demands, whatever they may be, that you're putting upon the skeleton. That's how I would sort of denote bone health. And of course, a lot of these things also depend on the number of different ways that you look to measure it, as you mentioned. So you can look at, one of the only ways to really look at an acute effect on bone health at the moment is through biochemical markers in the blood. But interpretation of those responses is fraught with difficulty. And one of the other, I suppose the most common way that people look at bone health is by looking at bone mass or bone mineral density via a DEXA scan, which I'm assuming many of your readers will be relatively familiar with. And this provides an estimation of the amount of bone mineral tissue that you've got. But of course, even that only predicts about 60 to 65% of bone strength. So you also need to consider other elements of the bone, including, the geometry of the bone, its microarchitectural structure. So this is the difference between this soft, spongy bone and this, well, not soft, it's this open, spongy bone and this compact, hard bone. And so, there are a number of different parameters that would make up any measurement of bone, and therefore what makes bone health. So that's a rambling answer to the question.
No, it's complicated, and I think that there's a few things that have kind of done a disservice to determining bone health for athletes, and one of them is kind of this commercial availability of using blood biomarkers to determine all different types of health, one of which is bone. So you go in, you get a blood draw, commercial lab, and then you have some third-party interpretation of all of those blood biomarkers, and they try to kind of compartmentalize them into your cardiovascular health, your stress, using cortisol and things like that. And one of them is actually bone health. But as you really eloquently just displayed right there, it has to do with several different things. And even when you have all of those things available, which you do in your lab, it's still hard to tell a single person when you've done the DEXA scan, when you've done when you've done the biomarkers, when you've looked at everything. It's still hard to tell that one person, yeah, your bone health is excellent, poor, good. You're not at risk of a stress fracture. You are at more risk of a stress fracture. It's just complicated.
Yeah, really complicated. And I think, using biochemical markers in particular and trying to extrapolate out an interpretation into overall bone health is fraught with problems. I mean, it is very, very difficult. And sometimes, depending upon the situation, it's quite hard to necessarily say that having a high bone formation and a low bone resorption is good and the opposite is bad, because at any given time within a bone remodeling cycle, those things might be quite important independently. And of course, the big problem you've got with that is you're taking these measurements from the circulation, but of course you don't know where these markers are actually coming from. So when people start talking about bone turnover markers, it's a little bit confusing, because you're not really looking at direct bone turnover, right? I.e. bone turnover at the level of the bone cell is a coupled process. But obviously what you're measuring in the circulation is not necessarily directly reflective of that. So in other words, the bone formation marker responses that you're seeing could come from a completely different bone to the bone resorption marker responses that you're seeing. So that's problematic, of course. And as far as athletes are concerned, another interesting one, even with DEXA, which most people would see as being, providing the definitive answer on this, is that, quite often you compare these to normal scores, so to T scores or Z scores relative to age, etc. But of course, there what you're really doing is comparing that individual's responses to a standard normal individual across a standard curve. And of course, athletes quite often don't exist slap bang in the average person category. They're normally one end or the other. So you take a marathon runner, for example, who might be 55 kilos, and compare that to a rugby prop forward who might be 120 kilos. There's the two extremes right there. So is it relevant to compare or to analyze someone's bone health if they're an athlete, or one of those athletes in particular, relative to norm values? It might not be.
Yeah, and so what's starting to emerge is a little bit of this dichotomy, right? It's very, very difficult and complicated to tell somebody if they have good or poor bone health. But the practical solutions, and I always try to drill these conversations back to the practical, because we tend to get over focused on some of the nuance. The practical ramifications for the athlete that the athlete can actually do to better ensure their bone health in a lot of ways is actually relatively quite simple, and revolves around energy availability being one of, if not the biggest driving force in ensuring athletes have adequate bone health. Why don't we start to talk about how energy availability specifically affects bone health, and then how critical it is to have those higher levels of just total caloric energy availability?
Yeah, again, I mean, that's common. If we can just go back a step, I guess there are a couple of main, modifiable factors, I suppose, that could influence bone health in the athlete. And one of the important ones quite often, which is not often a popular message for the athlete, is to moderate training load, of course. So of course, one of the big problems may be, the training load, or a novel presentation. Well, this is as far as bone injuries are concerned specifically, but a novel presentation of a new training load, or an increase in volume, or a change in equipment, a change in surface. Those kind of things can exacerbate the bone injury risk. But of course, same for military personnel and athletes, that they don't often necessarily want to change their training regimen too much. And so you look to other things, and diet and nutrition undoubtedly, as well as sleep, recovery, and other factors like this will influence the bone, albeit maybe not as much as the mechanical load, which is probably one of the largest modifiable effectors of bone. But I think, if we then drill that down into diet and nutrition, then certainly energy availability is a critical component for sure.
And there's this number that's been floated around in a paper that you wrote to ensure adequate bone health, and that's 45 kcals per kilogram. So why don't we dive in a little bit to that recommendation that you proposed, like how it came about, and then what are some of the nuances of the other levels of the caloric recommendations that are listed in the paper. And all of these papers that we reference will be in the show notes for people to access afterwards.
Yeah, I think it's an interesting one. So, I mean, of course, energy availability, I mean, we probably need to go back to maybe basics, but it's calculated as the dietary energy intake minus the exercising energy expenditure. And it's usually reported in kilocalories per kilogram of fat-free mass or lean body mass. And nuance there, but they're relatively similar terms, relatively similar amounts. So it's essentially what you're looking at is it's the amount of increased energy, the amount of ingested energy that's remaining available to support that basic bodily function after the energy required for exercise has been taken into account, if that makes sense. So, you are right then. And one of the things that's been postulated is that energy balance seems to occur around 45 kilocalories per kilogram lean body mass or fat-free mass per day. And you're also absolutely right that you would struggle to see any decent level or elite endurance athlete get anywhere near that. So there are reports that amenorrheic female endurance athletes are down at around 15 kcal per kilogram lean body mass per day, which is a fair way off the 45 energy balance consideration. And so one of the things that people have started to sort of try to figure out, I suppose, is there, given that you're not going to get that endurance athlete to 45 kcal per kilogram lean body mass per day, is there a threshold, for want of a better word, above which you will not necessarily see such detrimental effects on the bone? And really, we've only got one or two studies that point towards this kind of threshold. And so, I definitely would not suggest that this is definitive in any way, shape, or form. But there is some suggestion that getting an athlete above 30 kcal per kilogram lean body mass per day would limit the potential negative effects of low energy availability on the bone. But again, that's based on a single study with an independent group's design. So that means different athletes were in the different low energy availability groups. And so, whilst was a nice study, that's still pretty thin evidence on which to base a clear recommendation. So, I think all we can really go on right now is to try to keep the periods of low energy availability as short as possible. And, that's easier in some types of athletes than others. Very, very difficult in an elite endurance population for sure. And the other one might be to try to periodize low energy availability periods in the training schedule, such that you can have periods of low energy availability that can still support a lot of those training and competition goals that athletes are focused upon. But at the same time, there are also periods of much higher energy availability to try and limit the negative impact on the bone. Does that make some sense?
Yeah, absolutely. And this concept that low energy availability isn't necessarily limited to a 24-hour period, which a lot of athletes will look at. A lot of athletes will look at, okay, here's the amount of energy expenditure I have in a day, as you mentioned, and here's how many calories I took in that day. Really, it needs to be broken down into smaller and smaller increments. And that's where it starts to get really fuzzy, but also extremely complicated for an ultramarathon athlete, which is going to be primarily this audience, because some of their training sessions last 4, 6, 8, 10 hours. And so this entire period of low energy availability can stretch into the 12 or even 20 hours, even if they're trying to refeed the entire time. So I've always kind of wondered, when ultramarathon athletes are undertaking these extremely long, arduous training sessions, of which they might, they might require 3 or 4 or even more than that 1,000 calories to actually kind of complete the activity. And there's no way that they can match that during the activity itself or even in the several hours afterwards, because you can only tolerate so much food. How much of a risk is that to bone health when we undertake those types of activities?
Yeah, again, it's a really great and quite complicated question.
Right.
So, I think You're absolutely right. I don't have any experience in doing any work on ultra marathon, although I think that would be a great population of athletes to look at. But we have done a few studies on triathletes, on some good level and elite level triathletes, and certainly you're talking about athletes there that train 2, 3, or 4 times a day, pretty much every day. There isn't really a complete off day. And, we've done a doubly labeled water study in some of those athletes, and they are sort of utilizing 4, 5, 6, 7,000 calories per day on average over a 10-day period. This is so, that's a massive amount of energy expenditure. And it's going to be really difficult to track that. And certainly on a day where you're training 4 times in a day, trying to eat enough food to ingest, the required amount of energy is going to be, very difficult, if not, virtually impossible. So practically, it's very, very challenging to do that. And I think in terms of negative effects on bone health, again, it's one of those things where I think what we're clear on is that consistent and prolonged low energy availability over time is definitely detrimental to bone. So those individuals who are in a consistent low energy availability state over weeks, months, years, then that is definitely not a good thing as far as the bone is concerned. But in terms of, for example, those individuals that might do that intermittently. So if we think, for example, of a weight classified athlete who may go for periods of low energy availability for a few days or a week or so at a time, and then refeed quite vigorously after that period of low energy availability, it's not quite so clear cut as to whether that is, negative or not. But certainly individual periods of low energy availability, even if they're quite severe, sort of 24, 48, 72 hours, is not generally a problem. You might get some short-term perturbations of bone metabolism, but as far as the overall bone health over time is concerned, it's not a major problem. Problem is what happens if you continue to repeat that. Again, that intermittent application of low energy availability is not quite as clear, but my guess, and it is just a guess really, is that would not be as detrimental as something that was sort of continuous and prolonged.
Yeah, you talked a little bit about periodizing low energy availability, which I think is a fascinating concept. And I honestly think a lot of endurance athletes who are trying to use low energy availability to lose a little weight are actually doing that they're doing it in the opposite way of which they need to be doing it. They're taking a big session, 4, 5, 6 hours, as we were just talking about. And because there's such a high caloric expenditure on that particular session, they're using that because of the heightened requirement for calories. They're using that as the period of which they're inducing this low energy availability, so therefore that they can lose weight. With my athletes, I take the opposite approach with athletes that are looking to lose a few pounds, where I look at where the training is the least intense. We're doing the least amount of intervals, the least amount of, high volume, supercritical workouts and things like that. And we try to shave off pounds during those particular time frames so that they have the adequate nutrition, not only to support bone health, but also to support all the other adaptations that we're trying to make during those training sessions. I'm wondering if you had any thoughts on how an athlete might actually go about like periodizing some of their nutrition specifically for low energy availability or weight loss in a healthy way. Like, what would be the best way to do it?
Yeah, I think my guess is that the way you're proposing to do it makes the most sense to me. I think the only resource that I've seen, and this is what I based my recommendation on in that paper that we were talking about, was this study, and it was a study by Trent Stellingworth. I don't know if you know Trent, but a very, very good exercise physiologist, and dabbles in performance nutrition for sure as well. But he conducted a paper on a Canadian elite athlete where they periodized some of these periodize some of this low energy availability and low carbohydrate availability. And it seemed to be relatively successful in maintaining a number of health-related parameters, not only sort of bone, but menstrual function and other things as well. So I can certainly dig out that paper and send it to you. It's probably the best piece of evidence that I can point to towards how and why and where you might look to periodize. But certainly this is not something that has been specifically looked at as far as bone is concerned, as far as low energy availability and bone is concerned, at least not to my knowledge. And so I think that's work to be done and work in progress, quite frankly.
Yeah, and this is just something once that you mentioned, it hasn't been done a lot, and I'm familiar with that case study. We'll link it in the show notes certainly. But I've always looked at it as low energy availability is always a risky proposition across a number of different parameters. The one that we're talking about right now just happens to be bone health. If I'm ever inducing that intentionally with an athlete, I want to minimize the negative outcomes as much as possible. Then I look at what are the training interventions that I'm using that have the least negative outcomes associated with them. And it's typically lower volume training, easier running. Maybe there's a period of 3 or 4 days where we're just doing, 1 or 2 hour endurance runs or something like that. I look at those as the opportunities because the risk isn't as high versus, hey, I'm going to go out and do an 8-hour run. And I know that, I'm going to be in a 2,000 or 3,000 calorie deficit after that run anyway. So I'm going to use that to lose a little bit of weight. I don't look at those as the opportunities because of all the other risk factors associated with it.
Yeah, I think that makes absolute sense to me. And I think, I definitely understand some of the rationale behind looking towards low energy availability periods, same with low carbohydrate availability periods, in that some of these practices may well be seen to drive some of the adaptations that you might want towards an endurance phenotype. So, I think that there are definitely, positive modifications as far as, training performance goes that you might want to use these kind of strategies, low energy, low carbohydrate availability strategies for. But as you rightly point out, there's a trade-off there. And I think, if you go too far with those, then there can be other detriments to performance, to health, to immune function, to all sorts of different things. And one of those things is definitely going to be bone health if it's continued over a prolonged period of time.
Well, you gave me a perfect transition to the next topic there. We can't let you off the hook here without talking about low carbohydrate and ketogenic diets, because it, as you're aware of, it's a quote unquote thing. And particularly in endurance circles, and then more specifically in the ultramarathon circles, it's even a bigger thing. And, you might be able to characterize it as contentious, like people dig their heels in. Oh, I'm in the high carb camp, I'm in the low carb camp. But there is this spectrum of strategies with which endurance athletes can use, as you said, to drive this endurance phenotype. They can train with low carbohydrate availability through a number of different ways, fasted way, 2-a-day training and things like that. Or they can adopt a low carb diet, either a ketogenic diet with less than 50 grams of carbohydrates per day, or a low carb diet where they're restricting their carbohydrates to 20% of their total macros or something like that. A lot of those flavors are becoming popular in the ultramarathon scene, certainly because they look at this proposition of, I want to be able to drive as much fat burning as possible in order to fuel myself for this performance. It does, as you mentioned, come as a consequence, regardless of whichever one of those strategies you want to undertake. And I don't want to peel apart each one, because that would take 5 podcasts or so, but let's, which we could do. I'd be up for that. But let's just try to generalize how carbohydrate availability specifically can impact bone health, and in certain cases when it might impact it more so than others.
Yeah, again, it's another one of those sort of areas that hasn't had too much specific research done on it. And I think, I coin a phrase from some presentations I've seen by James Morton, a friend of mine here from Liverpool in the UK, and he says it's not necessarily about high carbohydrate, low carbohydrate. It's about smart carbohydrate. And what he tends to mean by that is that each one of those strategies has a potential place to either drive a training adaptation, to drive an individual performance, to drive a part of an individual performance, quite possibly. And that seems to make some sense to me. But of course, people do. I think it's definitely a contentious area of consideration. But I mean, I think there are some sensible reasons why individuals would want to go low carbohydrate at various points, and that makes actually physiological sense to me as well. But I think again, rigorously following any of those patterns without the understanding or following the nuance is potentially problematic for the bone as well as many other things. But if we focus on the bone specifically, there are a few studies that suggest that the carbohydrate can influence the bone metabolism. So there were some original studies out of University of Sheffield here in the UK, which suggested that carbohydrate could be important and feeding could be important in moderating bone metabolism. But we've also, those weren't necessarily, they weren't at all, exercise studies, and that's the other thing. So I think when we've done some acute studies, so we've done some studies with carbohydrate feeding during exercise, we've done study with carbohydrate plus protein feeding post-exercise. There's been a recent study which was conducted by James Morton showing that low carbohydrate availability independently of low energy availability might influence short-term responses of the bone. And of course, there's a study or two now just coming out of the lab of Louise Burke, where they've looked at the short-term ketogenic diets and changes in bone metabolism. And generally, these exercise studies would suggest somewhat negative connotations from low carbohydrate availability as far as the bone is concerned. But again, a word of caution there, I suppose, in some respects, is that most of those studies haven't been scaled up and conducted over more prolonged periods of time, or what happens when, again, or what happens if you switch from a low carbohydrate diet to a higher carbohydrate diet in a different phase of training or competition, as some athletes may well do. And so, again, it's one of those highly nuanced questions that we don't have an awful lot of understanding of, and it's probably something that will develop over the next few years. We're just starting. I'm just starting as part of a team that's at University of Limerick in Ireland. We're just starting a PhD program of work now on exactly this topic. So hopefully we'll generate a bit more data over the coming few years on this. But yeah, it's certainly an interesting one. And I think, you can counteract some of those claims as well by looking at the fact that generally, for example, diabetics tend to have poorer bone health than the non-diabetics. You can also characterize some of the studies in particularly younger populations who have been receiving low carbohydrate diets for a number of different reasons. They tend to show either no detrimental or sometimes even positive effects of a low carbohydrate diet on the bone. So again, highly problematic to try and give a definitive answer on this right now, as it just isn't enough information. But all we can say is that the majority of the acute studies that have fed carbohydrate, so not necessarily low carbohydrate, that have fed carbohydrate, have shown positive effects on the bone. And obviously those one or two studies out of Louise's lab have shown potentially detrimental effects of ketogenic, albeit short-term ketogenic type diets on bone health.
Yeah, the one out of the Burke lab is the one that I'm the most familiar with. I found quite fascinating because they were able to control for all of the other variables, all the other nutritional variables that you could try to control for, including all of the micronutrients, calcium, vitamin D, and things like that. The thing that they can't control for because they're athletes is the training load. So they still had an intensified training load when they switched some of the athletes over to a ketogenic diet. And a lot of people will look at that, and I do myself, can look at that and go, well, it's the mismatch between the type of energy input and the type of energy output that the athlete is actually undertaking is what is a big part of any of the negative consequences that are going on in particular, and which would also include the bone health piece.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, any of these, there's no such thing as a perfect study, of course, and
Right,
that
right.
was, to be honest, that was a heck of a study. They did a very, very good job at controlling as many different variables as they possibly could, particularly over that time frame in elite athletes. I mean, they need to be congratulated for that. But yeah, of course, there's always going to be those. There's that other question about, is 3.5 weeks on a ketogenic diet long enough, et cetera, et cetera. But you try doing that study over a much longer period of time. It takes an awful lot of effort to get the level of control that they exerted on that experiment.
Yeah.
So try and do that over a much longer period of time, for example, would be very, very difficult. But
Yeah.
I think that's probably one of the best pieces of evidence we've got currently. Yeah, we need more, and we need probably more prolonged periods of carbohydrate intake, and many other different factors to be considered. But one of the other interesting points you make, if we go back to the low energy availability debate, actually, that you just triggered in my mind there, is that even then it's quite difficult, because if you look at, particularly from a dietary intake perspective, if you look at the way in which a lot of individual studies have reduced the energy intake, they've done it by taking an habitual diet and pretty much cutting it in half. And of course, what you get then is, yes, you get, let's say, a 50% reduction in energy intake, but you also get reduced intake of things like calcium, vitamin D, protein, carbohydrate. So with a lot of those studies, you can also question really whether it's energy, low energy that's the issue, or whether it's nutrient availability that's the issue. And so that's another avenue of nuance that needs to be investigated. Is it solely low energy, or is it low nutrient?
So let's pivot to that a little bit. And we're only going to beat the nutrition horse so much here, because I do want to transition to the load part of the equation, which you referenced earlier in terms of bone health. But you're absolutely right. It's not just energy availability. That's the big one. I think that's the big object in the room that we all need to pay attention to. But there are also some critical nutrients that are also incredibly important for bone health. Why don't we just give a quick overview of what those nutrients are?
Yeah, so I mean, there's a whole long list of nutrients that generally support bone health. And if you go to that nutrition and bone health paper that you're going to pop up, I think it's the first table. I think it's table 1 in that publication, that lists a number of different nutrients that are important for the bone. I mean, obviously, the ones that people will be most familiar with are going to be probably calcium, vitamin D, maybe phosphorus. But there are, magnesium's important, zinc, copper, potassium, of course, vitamin K2, vitamin C, vitamin A. There are a number of different micronutrients there that are relatively important for bone health. Of course, like I say, the big ones really that everyone would recognize probably are vitamin D and calcium, and they are vitally important for the bone, for sure. But there are a whole range of both direct and indirect effects of different nutrients on the bone and supporting bone metabolism, and so I think the things that would nutritionally support the skeleton of everybody is going to be, the same if you're an athlete, so, getting that nutritional support for the bone is going to be vitally important. Of course, one of the things we're not particularly clear on is how, the types of exercise and training that athletes perform, how that influences the nutrient requirements, the micronutrient requirements in particular of the athlete. So, what meets a recommended daily allowance for a non-athlete might not necessarily be sufficient for an athlete. And of course, one of the other things to think about is if you're just looking at recommended dietary intakes, whatever version of that you look to follow, they're really designed to prevent a deficiency in a majority of the population. What they're not there to do is optimize a situation. And so we still don't really know what the optimal situation for an athlete would be as far as, the availability of those micronutrients in particular.
When we talk about micronutrients and vitamins, a lot of people are first going to turn their attention towards supplementation. And one of the things practitioners, coaches, and people like yourself always stress with athletes is a food first approach to fuel themselves with the calcium, the vitamin D, the iron, and all those other things. But as an athlete, specifically in respects to bone health, is there anything that they should be or would consider supplementing on top of a normal healthy diet that's going to cover their caloric requirements for the day?
Well, again, it's one of those interesting things. I mean, we've covered a little bit about the practicalities of feeding an athlete who might be training for either a very long period of time in a given day or might be training multiple times in a day. And obviously, feeding whole food at any given time in that period might be quite tricky. And so turning to supplementation, whether that be via carbohydrates or protein, or whether it be, some calcium supplementation, for example, it is always a strategy worth considering once you've determined what you can and can't do via food alone. I would definitely reiterate food first is the way forwards. Absolutely, 100%. But then where other things intervene, so for example, if you're trying to correct a deficiency, and quite often in athletes, the two things we talk about there most often probably are vitamin D and iron. So if you're trying to counteract a deficiency, then supplementation is worth considering. There may be some acute effects and positive effects of supplementation around hard exercise training sessions, for example. So there's a little bit of evidence around pre-exercise calcium supplementation to support bone health, particularly in sort of more prolonged endurance type activities. And of course, we've shown that feeding some carbohydrate during the activity or feeding carbohydrate and protein after the activity can modify the bone metabolic response. But again, these are quite acute studies, and we need to see really what happens to adaptations if you scale that up over time. And that's by no means clear cut. So, I mean, I think depends on again, what you mean by supplements. But I think those kind of consistent supplements with, multivitamins and things like that are worth considering where there's a dietary deficiency, for example, or an insufficiency. Because an athlete may not be able to eat the food that you're talking about, or they may not necessarily like the food that they need to consume to get a lot of these micronutrients in. So where you're talking about correcting a deficiency in the diet or some other form of deficiency, then supplementation is always a consideration.
Is there anything that athletes need to watch out for supplementation? Because there's a lot of products on the market that, and I think this is particularly relevant with bone health. there's a lot of supplement products out on the market that will claim that they improve bone health when in fact, if taken in excess or even sometimes taken to the dosage that is recommended on the label, they can be detrimental to bone health. And in an effort of full disclosure, you're allowed to throw anybody under the bus on this podcast. I always mention to my guests that there are no sponsors on this podcast. There's intentionally no sponsorship on this podcast. I don't look for it. I turn them all down when I bring them in. And one of the reasons is because I get solicited, particularly from nutrition companies, a lot. To provide advertisement on this podcast, and I don't want that conflict of interest to ever exist. And I know that you're familiar with this area. So is there anything that athletes specifically should watch out for in terms of supplementation, things that might actually impair or be detrimental to their bone health?
Well, I mean, I think, again, the great rule of thumb with this is, you always beware of anybody bearing gifts, right? Because if it sounds too good to be true, it usually is too good to be true. And so, no, I mean, I think generally speaking, there isn't any need to go for mega doses of anything or to look at really extrapolating out, because there's always this danger that you say, so-and-so A is particularly good for bone health and or whatever it may be, or performance is even a bigger one. And then the natural assumption of people looking at that is that more is always better. And that most definitely isn't the case. And to a certain extent, we've gone through a little bit of that with things like vitamin D, for example, where you now got people throwing in really, really large, high amounts of vitamin D to the system. And I think there is a little bit of evidence actually that these sort of mega doses that are designed to prop up the circulating vitamin D concentration over a prolonged period of time might actually be a little more detrimental to the bone. There are a couple of studies, not in athletes at all, but in older individuals, where the incidence of falls and fractures has gone up with really, really high dose vitamin D supplementation. Again, those studies are associational; they're not necessarily causative, but you can see some potential there with these sort of mega dosing, and I don't necessarily think for the athlete that there is any need to do that. You can stay within relatively normal parameters, maybe a little bit more than the recommended daily amount. But like I said, we don't really know what the position to optimize the bone health and the micronutrient availability of an athlete is yet. So it's even difficult to say that. But one of the big things that I think you need to be careful about is where you get your supplements from, actually, and what source, and are they appropriately tested, particularly if your athlete is open to drug testing as part of their training and competition, because you would want to make sure that you're getting a supplement from a reputable source that tests its products and gets them independently tested on a batch by batch basis, because otherwise you could find yourself, of course, and inadvertently failing a drugs test, and there's plenty of examples of that kicking around.
Oh yeah, you ain't kidding. So USADA is right around the corner from me, and we have a lot of mutual colleagues over there. That's a battle that they fight daily.
Yeah.
The contaminated supplement battle. It is a big problem, and I know it's worldwide, but particularly because supplements are not regulated at all here in the U.S., it is a huge issue. But I got a kick out of one of your comments that we tend to think that if a little bit is good, mega doses are better.
Yeah.
If there's any cohort that is subject to that fallacy, it's the ultramarathon cohort. If a little bit of mileage is good, a whole lot of mileage is better, and then mega mileages are best. And we tend to take that and translate it into other areas of our lives, and vitamin and supplement might actually be one of them.
Quantity and quality are not necessarily the same thing.
Exactly. All right, I appreciate that, Craig. So let's pivot a little bit and talk about women. And I know you're home because you're in quarantine right
Right,
now.
yeah.
So if you need to bring your wife into the equation, who you can mention to start to discuss some of this, you're more than welcome to, and we can explain while we're laughing about that. A lot of listeners aren't going to be familiar with the connection there, but there are certain things that women need to pay attention to in regards to bone health that are obviously different than men, not only on the susceptibility side, but also things having to do with their menstrual cycle and where they are in their menstrual cycle, and any sort of contraceptives that they actually might be taking. Can you give us kind of a broad overview of some of the nuances that women might have to look at in terms of how to maintain proper bone health?
Yeah, you're definitely talking to the wrong sale as far as this conversation is concerned. But I mean, I think certainly, there are some little bits of evidence. For example, if we go back to one of our previous conversations, that the women might be a little bit more susceptible to the effects of low energy availability on bone health than men, such that maybe they have their bone has a bigger response at not such a severe low energy availability as you would need to induce in the men to see the same negative effect on the bone. But again, that's really only one or two studies, and it's not definitive by any stretch of the imagination. But of course, one of the things that is probably easiest to point to as far as this is concerned is the female athlete triad, that most people will be familiar with that term, I'm sure. And this kind of links in along a continuum between, so it links in this triad. So essentially the triad is bone health, is menstrual function, and energy availability. And each one of those exists along a continuum between sort of what is normal, so you've got, energy replete, normal menstrual function, good bone health, right the way through to a clinical manifestation, which is, problems with, abnormal menstrual function, low energy availability, and poor bone health, stroke, osteopenia, osteoporosis. And so, this was a syndrome that was initially described, as the name would suggest, specifically in female athletes. Although it has now moved on to consider whether there would be a male athlete triad, and of course there isn't that other syndrome, the Rett syndrome, that kind of describes a very, very similar thing, albeit on a wider set of symptoms. So yeah, there are a number of things, and of course, the age-associated reduction in bone mass tends to be a little bit greater and a little bit quicker in women, particularly post-menopause, once those protective effects of the estrogen concentration drops out. So, kind of around that age of 50, 55, there's a slightly accelerated bone loss in females than there is in males. Of course, that might not necessarily be particularly a problem for the age of many elite female athletes, but of course, if they've got things that impinge upon the attainment of peak bone mass during childhood and adolescence and early adulthood, for example, then and therefore their peak bone mass is lower, then they've obviously got potentially a bigger problem once the accelerated rate of age-associated bone loss comes in. So I think there are a number of things there. You also mentioned sort of the use of hormonal contraception, and there are little bits and pieces of evidence around that certain types of approaches may negatively affect bone health. In particular, we've got a little bit of data that's suggesting that those individuals who use the contraceptive injection, so they downregulate their estrogen concentrations over more prolonged periods of time, so maybe 2-3 months at a time, that is a little bit more detrimental to the bone than other contraceptive approaches. But again, it's small numbers. It's only really 1 or 2 studies, so that's by no means clear cut either. But yeah, I'd say they're the main issues.
We'll have to. So for those of you who kind of are missing the inside joke here, Craig's wife Christy happens to have some domain expertise in female physiology, and I've heard her on a number of podcasts, and I've read a number of her articles. So we'll have to bring her on there very specifically, maybe both of you in tandem, to talk specifically about that. Do you guys talk about that at the dinner table? Or can you just like put all this stuff aside when you sit down and you have to have a normal meal?
Yeah, no, we try not to talk too much about that. The kids normally start rolling their eyes if we do that, but we normally sort of we hold some decent debates at times, but yeah, we try and keep it to a minimum if we can.
That's gotta be fun.
I'm busy eating, to be honest. We're at the dinner table.
I was about to say, because it always involves food, and there's something around the dinner table, and I just can imagine it's just incredibly complicated and can get way out of control way too quickly.
Yeah, particularly as we quite often come from these sorts of things from very different perspectives, so it can descend into an academic argument fairly quickly. But yeah, it's all good.
Okay. All right. Well, we'll broach that bridge at some point.
No, we work together a lot, so we're used to that.
Oh man. Okay. Let's go on to the last topic. So we talked a whole lot during this podcast about how nutrition modulates bone health. But as you were very quick to mention, once I dove down that rabbit hole, the other side of the equation is loading. And this is actually something I think that more athletes they just put a bigger magnifying glass on, because they're looking at training load in terms of the performance outcome. How much mileage can I pack on? How quickly can I add intervals? How quickly can I add speed work and things like that? But we also know that training load and the rate at which you start to increase training load can negatively affect bone health. And so much so, there have been all these retrospective studies that have looked at athletes that have gotten injured and said, okay, what are some of the key indicators that we can tease out of this process of an athlete getting injured? Is it the amount of mileage that they did? Is it the rate that they ramped it up? So what can you tell us about how athletes can safely manage their training load to avoid this situation of having some sort of bone stress reaction or bone fracture?
Yeah, it's another really good question, and I think one of the things that you sort of pointed towards there in terms of what you're talking about is that kind of idea of whether it's the duration of load or the magnitude of load that really makes a difference. And again, that's a really, really good consideration, because it's not immediately clear either in terms of whether it's that high intensity but relatively low duration that's the problem, or whether it's the other way around, whether it's that low consistent load produced over a prolonged period of time that's the problem. And it could just as easily be either, actually. And that, I suppose, is the problem. I think in terms of a few clear guidelines, thinking about it, I think you tend to see more bone stress injuries when you acutely significantly increase the load. So if you, for example, increase mileage quite significantly. So if we take, or you increase the intensity quite significantly, or you change footwear, or you change surface, particularly if you do, again, you combine two or three of these things. I think the prime example of that is you tend to see quite a lot of bone stress injuries in football players, in soccer players, when they undergo that pre-season training phase.
Right.
So they've had a little bit of period of time off. They come back, and then you go through this really intensive 6-8 week period of time where you go almost from the lowest loading that occurs during a season, i.e. the off-season period, to probably the highest, which is the pre-season period, one after the other. So kind of acutely applying those significant changes in training volume and training load, they're the times to start looking out for things for bone stress injuries. It's not a one-to-one ratio by any stretch of the imagination. So you can't necessarily say that they all occur during this time, because they definitely don't. But you've also got to sort of consider that a stress fracture is not a stress fracture is not a stress fracture. And what I mean by that is that there might be different etiologies towards different types of stress fracture. So an example of that I give quite often is that the rowers, for example, suffer quite a lot of rib stress fracture injuries. And generally it's thought of that these things are quite biomechanical, i.e. they're technique driven, such that you're ending up, by the technique that the individual is applying, you're ending up putting a significant amount of load at a very specific point on quite a small bone within in the rib. But that might be quite a different etiology and development to a mid-tibial stress fracture, for example, or a pelvic stress fracture or a navicular stress fracture, all other common sites in different types of athletes. So again, it gets complicated. And of course, you may have some genetic predisposition in there and all sorts of different things. So it's difficult to say, but definitely the things to look out for are changes in equipment, changes in surface, acute rapid increases in changes of either load or duration or intensity. I think one of the other things, as far as the bone is concerned, that might be particularly pertinent to your audience is whether these kind of long, slow, relatively low load or lower load types of activity are more detrimental because they induce a low mechanosensitivity to the bone. So there are some studies in rats that suggest that actually the bone becomes maximally mechanosensitized quite quickly, very short, few number of loading cycles, few minutes of activity. So that the maximum amount of sensitivity of the bone to loading occurs quite quickly. And there's also this suggestion that to restore that sensitivity of the bone to load takes maybe a rest period of about 4, 5, 6 hours, something along those kinds of lines. So actually, those kind of high intermittent loads, intermittent, I mean with quite prolonged recovery periods, might well be best for inducing positive adaptations to the bone. But of course, that's quite the opposite to what a marathon runner or an ultra marathon runner would do. They would go out at probably a much lower load, and they would just keep that going for tens of minutes, hours, etc. So there will be still an initial benefit potentially to that, but do you reduce or minimize or even negatively change that adaptive signal by the prolonged low level loading?
Yeah, you've hit on what I call the 4 villains that I've seen emerge in my coaching career, and I've been coaching long enough to have the perspective that each one of these villains has emerged as the big villain at certain points. And we've now come to learn that there's a synergistic effect between all of them. And the 4 villains are biomechanics. As you mentioned, when we see a bony stress injury, we used to just go straight to the biomechanics. We're going to throw an athlete on a treadmill. We're going to look at their stride. Okay, your right stride is longer than your left one, or you're landing this way on your foot. Let's quote unquote fix that. New shoes, new stride, kind of whatever. But biomechanics.
Yeah, another injury quite often changes your biomechanics, and so that sometimes is a red flag for a bone stress injury. Recovery 100%. From a knee injury quite often then leads to a stress fracture.
Yeah, 100%. But that was at one point in time almost the de facto way that we would look at bone stress injuries, is there was something biomechanically going on, and we would try to quote unquote fix that. The second villain is high mileage, meaning, okay, you can only run some magic number, 120 miles per week, 14 hours per week, kind of whatever. And we need to keep all athletes below that. Or when we saw an athlete get injured, the automatic preventative measure or countermeasure that we would take would be to reduce their mileage. That was the second villain. The third villain, as you mentioned, and I think that this is starting to get the complexity is starting to increase as we go down the line, is the increase in training load, or what we call that from a technical perspective is the training load ramp rate. So you go from 20 miles a week to 30 miles a week. That's a 50% increase in load over 1 week. 30 miles a week isn't bad, but the 50% increase is. That's the villain, right? We started to look at that. And then after that, like the final villain in this whole story, and there might be another one, maybe genetics is the fifth villain to emerge in another few years now that nutrigenomics is becoming so popular. But the fourth villain that emerged was really the training density. So the impulses of the really high training stress, whether it's like high intensity intervals or maybe 2 or 3 back-to-back long runs and things like that, some concoction of that is what kind of produced the bone injury. And what I've learned over the course of time that I think your perspective could be really interesting on is it's really a synergy between all of those. So if you're going to increase training load, you need to make sure that the biomechanical variable or the density variable is minimized so that you're not compiling stress on stress on stress. If you increase the density, you do 2 back-to-back long runs, you do 2 hard runs back-to-back, and those are common training strategies amongst a lot of different athletes. You need to limit the biomechanical variables, you need to limit the mileage variables, and you need to limit the training ramp increase variables. So that's like the only sort of mechanical loading stress that the athlete is kind of undertaking. The mismatches occur when you're trying to induce a biomechanical change, trying to change their stride, they change footwear, and you're increasing mileage at the same time. Like those are the types of things that typically like undo the athletes more than anything else. Is what from a practitioner perspective we're trying to start to learn. It's not any one of those independent of all of them. It's the combination of 2 or 3 of them where things tend to go awry.
Yeah, exactly. I think that's put very, very nicely and very succinctly. I mean, I think, yeah, you're right. I think, there's quite likely to be a genetic predisposition to certain injuries, certain types of bone injury, not all by any stretch, but I think, a lot of these things in athletes can be modified by considering some of the things that we've talked about today. I mean, but doing that in a practical scenario can sometimes be quite difficult, and particularly in an athlete, changing an athlete in a coach's mind, particularly one who's maybe already successful doing what they're doing, then becomes, I mean, successful from a performance point of view. Then obviously, if that's the case, then changing their mind or looking about something in a different way, or saying, look, if you're going to get a stress fracture injury in competition year, you're going to be in trouble. All of those things, need to be weighed up. It's not a simple equation by any stretch of the imagination.
Yeah, and I've honestly always looked at stress reaction or stress fracture injuries. I've always looked at that through the lens of there's some or a lot of human error that cause that. Very like with other types of injuries or illnesses and things like that, like when an athlete loses training availability, a lot of those you can chalk up to dumb luck. Not to let coaches and athletes like off the hook with some of those other things, but a lot of them, like they get sick. Okay, they were exposed to a virus and, who knows how they got exposed. Sure, they could increase their hygiene and things like that. But with a bony stress injury, you usually can walk back the training and the behavior and the nutrition 3, 4, 5 weeks and start to look at the patterns and come up with a reasonable conclusion to why that actually happened. It's obviously not apparent in real time because you wouldn't have done it in the first place. but when you retrospectively look back at it, you're not going to have always the most crystal clear answers, but you can go, man, we really shouldn't have lost a pound while we induce this type of training stress or kind of whatever it is. That's the thing that I think becomes so frustrating with bony stress injuries, injuries is not only the lost training availability, and as I mentioned on the onset of this podcast, they tend to be like season killers because of the severity of them, but also the fact that you can look back at it and go, crap, I really screwed this up.
Yeah, and I think that's, I suppose in some respects they're called overuse injuries for a reason. In that sense, you can normally go back and think about it, which is, pretty different to a contact fracture, for example, which you think, well, there's not really too much I could have done. There's little things, but again, really, as you say, that's just dumb luck. But no, I think you're right. I think there generally are things that you can go back and point to. But I suppose at that particular time, that's not necessarily your primary focus when you're trying to do that. It becomes your primary focus once your athlete has got a bone stress injury. It's not what you're looking at preventatively, I guess.
Right, because we tend to look at training through the lens of improvement, right? How do I improve the athlete the most? Not through a defensive lens. How do I keep them healthy? And I think that when we lose that perspective, that's when things start to go awry. We got to let you go. Let's leave the listeners with some of those big things, though, because you've been studying this area for a long period of time. And I think that one of the perspectives that you're kind of entitled to are what are the big things? What are the 2 or 3 really critical things that you keep seeing come through your lab and that you keep seeing in the research that if athletes get these few things right, they understand these few concepts and they execute them in training, they might not be perfect, but they're going to prevent a lot of the negative outcomes in terms of bone health. What would those be?
Yeah, so I think in terms of what I know for sure, not a lot. What I guess my best guesses are right now, I would say, are exactly like you said in terms of those 4 villains, is avoid kind of particularly those rapid increases in training volume or intensity, particularly if you're also trying to combine that with other things that might red flag a bone stress injury risk. I think prolonged low energy availability, consistent low energy availability should be avoided if you can. And I know that's difficult, particularly in an elite endurance athlete population. But one of the things that you might start to look at, and we need a lot more information on this, but I do think, because telling an elite endurance athlete not to do that's never going to work. So you can't just say, well, just stop doing that and start eating 45 kcal per kilogram lean body. They're just not going to do that. It's never going to happen.
Right.
So that's pointless. But what I would maybe encourage people to start thinking about is whether they can periodize low carbohydrate, low energy availability around times where they want specific adaptations that can be brought about by those practices, and at other times then don't do that. Take the restriction off a little bit and try to maintain a higher energy availability. And I guess the other thing is, take a food first approach to a normal, healthy, balanced diet. Make sure you're getting in plenty of those, micronutrients, lots of green leafy vegetables, for example. And where that isn't a popular dietary strategy, then maybe consider some appropriate supplementation. And I think, there may be some value in considering specific feeding strategies around hard training sessions and hard training periods. But we really don't know enough about that for me to give you specific guidance right now. But certainly sort of feed and fuel around those hard training sessions would be the best bits of advice I can probably give right now.
Hey, that's good enough, man. I think you tend to underplay. Well, I love it how, this is Dunning-Kruger effect, right? Once you know a whole heck of a lot about a subject, you realize that you don't know that much about it. But I think in a lot of instances, people like yourself who study this for a living, you've been studying it for a long time, you tend to underplay the things that we do have relatively decent degrees of certainty on. They just happen to be the reasonable pieces of advice. which ain't sexy.
Yeah.
It's not gonna, they're not gonna win an Academy Award for drama or anything like that. I mean, if you're saying train sensibly, eat sensibly, maybe consider some supplementation if things are going awry, those are all really reasonable recommendations.
Yeah, I mean, it's one of those things that I've said before, and one of the things I point to is that it's taken me 15 or 20 years of studying this to realize that all the advice my grandma gave me was pretty much accurate, right?
Grandma's always right.
Drink
I love
milk,
it, man.
eat green leafy vegetable, all those sorts of things. It's like, yeah, fair enough. She was right.
All right, man. Well, listen to Grandma. Maybe that's our final piece of advice.
Grandma, always.
Craig, I really appreciate your time. Before we say goodbye, where can people learn a little bit more about you and the research that you do?
Yeah, so obviously you can just perform the normal sort of searches for the papers on PubMed. Just put me in as the author. You can Google me. I come up my institutional, so I'm Nottingham Trent University here in the UK. My institutional link will come up, and you can get access to a lot of the papers and stuff via that direction if you want more information. I'm on Twitter as well, so I think I'm at sale_xnut if you want to follow me. And so, I put out bits and pieces of information, retweet papers and retweet, people who say more sensible things than me and things on there. So, yeah, probably the main ways to get in touch. Yeah.
Awesome, Craig. Well, we appreciate your time. We appreciate what you have done in the research area, and we'll look forward to anything else that your lab and your university produces.
Oh, thanks very much for inviting me, Jason. It's been very nice to chat, and hopefully your listeners get something out of it.
It'll be great. Yeah, thanks for your time. All right, folks, there you go. What a great conversation with Craig. He was a good sport about it, coming all the way from the UK to record this podcast remotely. I've had a lot of people from the UK on recently, and in the whole world of remote podcast recording that we're in right now, this is just going to be more and more and more common. Craig, I really appreciate your time and your expertise that you lent to the listeners today, and we will look forward to having your wife, Kirsty, on the podcast at some future point to talk about all things related to women's specific physiology. Had hoot you guys. I hope you did too. If you like this podcast, go on over to iTunes and give it a like or a rating. That helps the podcast out a tremendous amount. Appreciate the heck out of everybody listening today. And as always, we'll see you on the trails at some point. Until then, stay happy, stay healthy, and stay safe out there, folks.